On a cold morning of mid-March in the year 1944, high above Berlin at almost 25,000 feet, a pilot from Bavaria flying a Messerschmitt looked through his canopy and burst into laughter as he watched an American P-51 Mustang struggle to line up a shot. From his view, the Mustang pilot looked like a nervous student trying to steady an aircraft he could not yet control, and the sight amused the German ace, who had 17 victory marks painted proudly beneath his cockpit. He believed these Americans with their fancy new fighters had no business escorting bombers this deep into German skies, for in his mind they lacked the skill to land a single proper deflection shot. To show his confidence, he rolled his 109 upside down, revealing the belly of his aircraft and the row of painted victory symbols, as if taunting the Mustang pilot to try something brave. Inside the Mustang, Lieutenant James Howard from St. Louis kept his focus as he flipped a small switch on his panel, awakening a quiet gyroscope behind a new aiming system that no one in the Luftwaffe had ever seen before. As the instrument hummed to life, the German pilot felt his laughter freeze, as if the sky itself had gone silent. The first burst from the American was shockingly precise, because the bullets did not go where Howard aimed, but where the machine calculated the German fighter would be in a little more than 1 second. The rounds walked neatly from the tail toward the cockpit, in a perfect rising pattern, as if guided by invisible hands. The Bavarian ace had only a heartbeat to wonder how the American had suddenly become a flawless marksman before his canopy shattered into bright fragments and his fighter spiraled away. He never managed to radio a warning to the other German pilots. In the next few minutes, Howard brought down 4 more Messerschmitts and damaged 3 others, leaving the surviving Luftwaffe pilots stunned and confused. They could not understand how these same Americans who had missed so often the previous day were suddenly hitting shots that no human could compute in such violent turning fights. The secret that destroyed those German aircraft had begun in a quiet British laboratory 2 years before, where scientists were not even thinking about fighter planes. The Royal Navy needed better ways to hit fast-diving enemy aircraft attacking their ships. A physicist named Mark Blackett had studied how naval gunners tried to track and fire on diving Stukas, and he discovered that a human brain attempting to predict where a moving aircraft would be, while the ship itself also moved, and the wind shifted and gravity pulled on the rounds, would succeed less than 2% of the time. The human mind was simply not designed to solve such fast 3-dimensional problems at hundreds of miles per hour. But a gyroscope connected to a small analog computer could perform those calculations instantly. The British later shared this technology with the Americans late in the year 1943. As part of their joint development program. The United States Navy considered it for ship guns, while the Army Air Forces nearly ignored it, because many fighter pilots saw themselves as gunslingers who prized instinct and natural skill. They believed a pilot should judge angles and speed on his own, not rely on a device that weighed nearly 18 pounds and required changes to the cockpit. Many commanders read the reports and then put them aside. But Colonel James Doolittle, overseeing fighter operations for the 8th Air Force, saw the true value the moment he read through the casualty sheets. With new fuel tanks, American fighters could now escort bombers all the way to German targets, but in the dogfights they were still being overwhelmed. Skilled German pilots, some with more than 100 victories, were destroying inexperienced American airmen at a ratio of 3-to-1. Doolittle ordered 100 of the new K-14 computing gunsights to be installed in P-51 Mustangs by March of 1944, whether the pilots liked it or not. Many did not. Captain Robert Johnson from Oklahoma had flown fighters for 2 years and knew how to judge angles and speed through instinct-alone skills built through countless hours of training. When he first received the new gunsight, he switched it off during his first 3 missions because he did not trust a machine to aim better than his own judgment. But on a mission over Stuttgart, he found himself in a heated turning battle with a Focke-Wulf 190 at 15,000 feet. The German pilot was skilled perhaps even better than Johnson, and every time Johnson tried to gain a firing angle, the German rolled away using the superior ability of his aircraft to slip out of danger. After several exhausting minutes, Johnson clenched his jaw and flipped the switch out of frustration. Instantly, the reticle became alive with motion as the range ring widened and tightened according to the wingspan of the German fighter, which he had set at 33 feet. Johnson stopped trying to guess where the opponent was going and placed the sight where the computer predicted the enemy would soon arrive. When he squeezed the trigger, all 6 of his half-inch guns sent their rounds into the exact point in the sky that the Focke-Wulf flew through a moment later. The German pilot probably never understood how an American pulling 4 GS in a tight turn made a shot that no human should have been able to compute. In that moment, the stage was set for the transformation of the air war. The gyroscopic gunsight did not care about strain on the body and did not blur under G-forces, and soon its impact began shaping the course of the war during the period known as Big Week, when Allied bombers struck German aircraft factories in February of 1944. By this time, nearly 300 P-51 Mustangs carried the new K-14 system, and the Luftwaffe noticed something unsettling from the very first engagements. One of their seasoned pilots, Oberleutnant Friedrich Beck, who had fought since the days of the Spanish Civil War and claimed 96 victories, wrote in his surviving after-action report that American accuracy had jumped overnight by an amount that seemed impossible. Shots that should have flown wide were striking his comrades with deadly consistency. Young American pilots with barely 20 hours of combat experience were landing complex deflection hits that only elite veterans normally mastered. On the 20th of February, the truth began to appear more clearly to some German pilots, though none yet understood its mechanics. Major Wilhelm Guth led 12 Messerschmitt 109s from Augsburg into the sky at 23,000 feet, where they encountered 8 American P-51s, escorting B-17 bombers. Guth was confident, for every pilot under his command held at least 20 victories, and he believed the small American group would be easy prey. But when the first exchange came, 4 German fighters fell at once, not glancing hits, but total destruction, as if the Americans had anticipated the exact flight paths of their targets. Guth himself barely survived after an American lieutenant from Texas placed nearly 200 rounds into his aircraft at an angle that should have been impossible to compute. The bullets struck the tail and continued forward as though following a drawn line across the metal skin. Only a desperate snap roll saved his life, and even then he lost much of his rudder. As Guth tried to understand the silent precision cutting through his formation, he saw that the Americans were not firing at where his aircraft was in that instant. They were firing at where it would be in the near future. That was not something the human brain could calculate in a twisting dogfight, where speed, altitude, and gravity constantly shifted the geometry. Only when Guth managed to get close to one American fighter did he catch a glimpse of the strange glowing sight in the cockpit, and to his disbelief, the American pilot was not even using it in the traditional way. He was simply flying and letting something else compute the firing solution. Guth returned home with half a plane and even less confidence, and only 3 of his 12 pilots returned with him. In the American formation, one pilot named Lieutenant David Williams from Nebraska had entered combat as an inexperienced flyer who struggled with the mathematics of deflection shots. Before the K-14, he had never managed a confirmed kill. He understood academic mathematics, but aerial gunnery was not chalkboard work. To shoot down an enemy, you had to guess speed, distance, and future position, all within a second, while pulling several GS and avoiding enemy fire. It was not arithmetic, but a mixture of instinct and survival, and Williams lacked the natural gift. But with the K-14, everything changed. The gyroscope measured turn rate, and the computer predicted the future position of the enemy based on motion and speed. All Williams needed to do was match the wingspan of the target to the ranging diamonds, twisting the grip until the span of the German fighter fitted inside the glowing ring, and then place the pipper where the computer told him. The machine solved the impossible geometry for him. In the fight over Augsburg, Williams shot down 2 Messerschmitts and damaged another. One of his kills was the kind of shot that would have made him a legend in any other era. The German fighter dove at a 40-degree angle while rolling to throw off pursuit. Williams followed in a high G barrel roll that twisted both aircraft in shifting spirals of altitude and velocity. A modern digital computer might need several seconds to calculate the intersection point of their trajectories, yet the K-14 did it instantly. Williams simply held the pipper ahead of the rolling target and squeezed the trigger. His bullets struck the engine and cockpit. At the exact moment, the German fighter crossed that invisible point in space. As the Luftwaffe tried to adjust their tactics, they began performing more violent evasive maneuvers, pulling G-forces that pushed the limits of their airframes and their own bodies. Some pilots nearly blacked out in these desperate attempts. Yet it did not matter. The K-14 could track smoothly through a 9G turn far beyond what any human could endure. German pilots began changing direction, randomly hoping unpredictability might confuse the system, but randomness from a human hand was never truly random. The computer recalculated 60 times each second and always found the solution. A few of the most experienced German aces realized that the only way to fight was to get so close that deflection shooting became irrelevant. Close-range, knife fighting reduced the advantage of predictive targeting, but that also meant abandoning their tactical superiority and engaging inexperienced American pilots at ranges where numbers mattered more than skill. These adjustments offered no real solution for the Luftwaffe. By April of 1944, the kill ratios reversed completely. The Americans were now shooting down 3 German fighters for every one they lost. The German training system was collapsing under the strain, and new pilots were rushed into combat with barely 50 hours of total flight time. They were facing American pilots whose K-14 gun sights gave them the accuracy of veterans with 1,000 hours. Many German pilots soon refused to engage P-51s directly. They tried to wait until escorts drifted away from the bomber formations, then dive in for a quick strike before escaping. But even these hit-and-run attacks became deadly when American bomber gunners began receiving their own computing gun sights. The Luftwaffe was discovering that the enemy had leapt into a new age of aerial warfare, and they were still fighting with human instinct against a machine that never tired, never guessed, and never miscalculated. The Luftwaffe tried every method they could imagine to counter the growing American advantage, but nothing worked because the K-14 gun sight removed the guesswork that had always decided aerial battles. German pilots began attempting sudden changes in direction to break enemy aim, yet even those evasive maneuvers failed because human randomness was never true randomness. The computer inside the gun sight recalculated 60 times each second, giving the American pilot an updated firing prediction faster than any brain could understand. A few of the most experienced German aces realized the only tactic that offered any hope was to engage at point-blank range where deflection angles did not matter. They needed to force knife fights where instinct and reflex might level the odds. But closing distance meant sacrificing their historical advantage in speed and energy, and it forced them to fight on terms that played into American strength in numbers. By April of 1944, the kill ratios shifted so dramatically that even German commanders admitted the skies were slipping away. American fighters were now shooting down 3 German aircraft for every one they lost. Luftwaffe training had crumbled. New pilots were rushed into combat with less than 50 hours of total flight time. They barely understood their aircraft, let alone the complex art of gunnery. Against the K-14, they were helpless. Many German pilots chose not to engage P-51s unless absolutely forced to do so. Instead, they waited for a moment when the escorts moved slightly away from the bomber boxes, then swooped in for a fast single attack before retreating. Even this grew risky once American bombers began receiving computing gun sights for their defensive weapons. One German instructor, Captain Hans Müller, discovered this firsthand in May of 1944, when his squadron engaged a group of P-51s that appeared to be low on fuel and ready to break formation. Müller and his 6 experienced pilots launched a perfect attack from the sun, expecting an easy victory. The Americans did what any pilot would do when bounced. They broke hard into the attack. What Müller did not expect was for the trailing Mustang, flown by a lieutenant from Georgia, with barely 12 days of combat experience, to pull an extremely tight climbing turn and fire a burst lasting less than 2 seconds that ripped Müller's wingman out of the sky in a single devastating shot. Every round struck with unnatural precision, tearing the German aircraft apart. Müller attempted to maneuver behind the young American, but the Mustang pilot fought with skill far beyond his limited experience. He used energy tactics, climbing, diving, and cutting angles with remarkable efficiency, and each time he fired, he struck something vital. Not glancing wounds, but crippling blows that broke wings and shattered engines. Müller watched in disbelief as the 22-year-old lieutenant shot down 3 of Germany's best pilots in mere minutes. When Müller finally managed to glimpse the American gun sight, he saw something glowing and moving in a way no simple reticle should behave. It looked like a laboratory instrument mounted inside a fighter aircraft, shifting and adjusting in real time with the violence of the battle. That American pilot was Lieutenant Tommy Harrison, who before the war had worked in his father's hardware store in Atlanta. He had never fired a weapon before joining the Army Air Forces, and during training he had been rated a poor marksman, struggling even with the basics of leading a moving target. His instructor had recommended that he be removed from fighters and reassigned to multi-engine aircraft, but fate brought him to the P-51, where the K-14 turned him from an uncertain student into a lethal combat aviator. The gunsight required no natural talent. Harrison only needed to fly and trust that the machine would always calculate the correct shot. By the end of his tour, Harrison had 17 confirmed victories. Based on his gunnery scores in training, he likely would have been shot down on his first mission without the computing gunsight. Desperate for answers, German High Command sought to capture an intact K-14, and in June of 1944, they almost succeeded when Lieutenant Robert Taylor from Michigan was shot down near Frankfurt. Though Taylor survived, his Mustang, nicknamed Detroit Special, remained mostly intact, including the prized gunsight. German technical teams rushed to the wreckage and recovered the device. Yet instead of clarity, they found deeper confusion. The basic idea of a gyroscope, linked to an analog computer, seemed understandable in principle, but the level of precision needed to keep such a device stable inside a violently maneuvering fighter aircraft shocked them. They lacked the specialized manufacturing capacity required to create such perfect balance in a gyroscope. Their factories were scarred by bombing raids and could not produce components with the needed accuracy. They could not replicate the special lubricants designed to function in freezing conditions at high altitude, nor could they produce enough copies to field them widely even if they solved the engineering challenges. No time remained to train pilots who now entered combat with barely 30 hours of total flight experience. Many were shot down on their first or second mission. Psychological shock began to spread through the Luftwaffe. Pilots who had trained for years mastering the art of deflection shooting now found themselves outmatched by American flyers who had barely arrived at the front. What had once been an art form based on intuition, practice, and survival became a contest of human instinct against mechanical prediction, and the machine always won. The Americans were not merely matching German skill. They were bypassing it entirely with a weapon that erased the learning curve and turned novices into aces. Across German airfields, the same quiet fear grew. The sky was no longer a duel of equals. It had become a place where mathematics ruled, and the Luftwaffe did not have the tools to fight back. The psychological shock spreading through the Luftwaffe grew heavier with each battle because German pilots who had spent years refining their deflection shooting now faced Americans who had been in combat for a handful of days, yet could fire with impossible accuracy thanks to a machine that never grew tired, never hesitated, and never misjudged. One of Germany's most respected aces, Major Gunther R., who had accumulated 275 victories later, wrote that the arrival of the K-14 Gunsight was the moment he believed the air war was lost. It was not only the technology itself that frightened him, but the realization that American factories could produce thousands of these devices and install them in hundreds of fighters while also training thousands of young pilots to use them. The Gunsight became a symbol of industrial strength as much as scientific power, and the Luftwaffe had no answer. One American pilot captain, Bill Anderson from Ohio, initially believed the device was little more than a crutch for inexperienced flyers. Anderson had earned 3 victories the traditional way by relying on instinct and timing, and he considered the computing Gunsight almost like cheating. But everything changed for him on the 29th of July in 1944 during a mission over Hamburg. His squadron encountered a large group of Focke-Wulf 190s that were diving at 60 degrees from directly above the B-24 Liberators, attempting to score one quick burst before peeling away. Their speed and angle made them almost impossible targets for escort fighters, because the geometry of those attacks was nearly unworkable for the human mind. Anderson rolled, inverted, and dove to intercept one of the attacking fighters, but the angle between them was so extreme that no veteran pilot would attempt a shot. Anderson trusted the K-14 for the first time. He placed the ranging diamonds around the German fighter, adjusted the wingspan to 33 feet, and watched the bright Pipper slide ahead of the enemy aircraft to a point in seemingly empty sky. When the Pipper settled, he fired a burst lasting 3 seconds. The German fighter flew directly into the stream of bullets and shattered in midair. Anderson pulled out of the dive stunned because he had just made a shot that would have been impossible for any pilot relying only on instinct. He returned to altitude and with the same device shot down 2 more German aircraft with frightening efficiency. His wingman, who did not yet have a K-14, fired 800 rounds that day and never landed a hit. After that mission, Anderson never switched the Gunsight off again, and by the end of the war, he had 14 confirmed victories with 11 earned after receiving the computing sight. German commanders struggled to develop new tactics to counter the Americans. They attempted to force close-range engagements where the K-14 advantage weakened. They tried approaching from angles where Mustangs could not bring guns to bear. Some pilots even attempted ramming tactics because at such close distances no device or human error could miss. Yet none of these measures succeeded. The Americans adapted quickly and trusted their machines completely. By August of 1944, some Mustang squadrons reported hit rates above 30%, meaning almost 1 bullet in 3 struck a target. Before the arrival of the K-14, the hit rate had been below 2%. This technological shift also transformed unlikely pilots into deadly aces. One of them was Lieutenant Frank Peterson from Minnesota, who at 31 years old was considered far too old for fighter work. His reflexes were slower than the young men beside him, his eyesight weaker, and his ability to withstand high G maneuvers reduced. During training, he ranked dead last in aerial gunnery, and instructors urged removing him from fighters entirely. But circumstance placed him in a P-51 squadron where he received the computing Gunsight. On his first mission with it over Munich, he shot down a Messerschmitt 109 with a deflection shot so complex that even master marksmen would rarely attempt it. The German fighter had been climbing in a spiral trying to gain altitude above the bomber formation, and Peterson was diving from the opposite direction. Their speeds, angles, and altitude differences created a moving geometry almost impossible to solve. Yet the K-14 computed everything instantly, allowing Peterson to place the Pipper exactly where the German aircraft would arrive. His burst struck the engine and cockpit, and the Messerschmitt fell in flames. Over the next 3 months, Peterson achieved 8 more victories despite being outmatched in age, reflexes, and physical strength. He proved that the computing gunsight elevated ordinary pilots to the level of skilled hunters, and German pilots found themselves facing opponents who could suddenly shoot like seasoned veterans. The Luftwaffe response grew more desperate as American dominance increased. They launched attacks on Allied airfields across France and Belgium, hoping to destroy P-51s on the ground before they could take off. They deployed the Me-262 jet fighter, which possessed unmatched speed and could complete attacks before the K-14 calculated firing solutions. But there were too few jets, and Allied fighters learned to strike them during takeoff and landing when they were vulnerable. Some German pilots even repainted their aircraft with American markings to slip close before being identified. These were signs of an air force in collapse. In September of 1944, Major Richard Turner from California led his squadron on an escort mission to Leipzig when they encountered German fighters using a new avoidance tactic. Instead of engaging, they made a single fast pass at the bombers, then dove at high speed toward the ground using detailed knowledge of the terrain to escape beneath Allied pursuit. It was a directed mission that they could no longer stand against the Mustangs in open combat. Even so, Turner's squadron shot down 6 German fighters that day, all with deflection shots made possible by the K-14, including one at a staggering 800 yards, a range where hitting a moving fighter had once been considered pure luck. As months passed, the technology only improved. By October of 1944, newer K-14 models could automatically adjust for thin air at altitude, the curvature of the Earth's subtle shifts in bullet trajectory due to spin and countless other variables that most pilots did not even know existed. The gunsight was performing layers of physics that no human could calculate in time. The skies belonged to those who carried the machine. Lieutenant Frank Peterson's unlikely rise from struggling trainee to deadly Mustang ace was only one example of how the K-14 transformed the air war, because the device allowed pilots who lacked natural instinct or refined skill to outshoot opponents who had spent years mastering the art of aerial gunnery. Peterson's deflection kill over Munich had been only the beginning. For 3 months, he continued to score victories not because he outflew German pilots, but because he outshot them with the help of a silent machine that did the hardest thinking for him. The Luftwaffe recognized the danger and grew increasingly desperate. Their command ordered attacks on American airfields in France and Belgium in hopes of destroying the Mustangs before they could launch, but even these missions cost the Germans more aircraft than they destroyed. At the same time, Germany deployed their advanced Me-262 jet fighter, whose blistering speed allowed it to attack bomber formations, then flee before escorts could line up shots. The K-14 struggled to compute at extreme closing speeds, but there were too few jets and many were destroyed during takeoff and landing while their engines struggled to accelerate. Some German pilots resorted to painting their aircraft with American markings in a final attempt at deception, hoping to get close enough for a single chance at a kill before fleeing. Such tactics revealed how far the once powerful Luftwaffe had fallen. In September of 1944, Major Richard Turner from California led a squadron of P-51s on an escort mission toward Leipzig. What they found this time was something entirely new. German fighters refused to engage directly. Instead, they made one swift attack on the bomber boxes, then retreated at maximum speed, diving low to skim across the landscape and escape into valleys and forests where their local knowledge of terrain would help them hide. It was a clear message that open confrontation against the Mustang was now suicide. Even so, 6 German aircraft fell that day, and every single one was shot down through deflection shots guided by the K-14. One of these kills occurred at a range of 800 yards, a distance so long that in the earlier years of the war, a pilot would need either a miracle or an entire belt of ammunition to land a hit. Yet with the computing sight, the bullet solution was calculated instantly, and the German fighter was struck with precision, as if the sky itself had turned against him. As the battles continued into late 1944, the K-14 grew even more advanced. Newer versions, automatically adjusted for thin air at high altitude, for the rotating curvature of the Earth, and for the subtle bending of bullet paths caused by projectile spin. These calculations happened faster than any pilot could comprehend, and most American flyers never even realized how much the machine handled for them. One Mustang pilot, Lieutenant Paul Rodriguez from Texas, tested these new enhancements at 29,000 feet while fighting a Messerschmitt. Traditional gunnery at that altitude was almost impossible due to thin air, which reduced bullet stability, but the K-14 adapted instantly. Rodriguez framed the German fighter with the ranging diamonds, set the proper wingspan, and squeezed the trigger. The bullets arrived exactly where the computer told them to. The German pilot never understood how he had been hit at an altitude where he thought he could fight safely. In November of 1944, the Luftwaffe attempted one final gamble to shift the balance with an ambitious operation named Bodenplatte. The aim was to destroy Allied aircraft on the ground during a surprise attack on New Year's Day. The Germans launched more than 100 aircraft and managed to destroy over 100 American planes on the airfields. But the cost was catastrophic. They lost 143 aircraft, including many of their most experienced remaining pilots. The Americans replaced their losses in a single week because their factories produced new P-51s faster than the Germans could destroy them. Meanwhile, the same American pilots who survived the attack, strapped into freshly repaired or newly delivered Mustangs, each one carrying the K-14 that had already reshaped the air war. When the Luftwaffe attempted to follow up Bodenplatte with conventional air operations, they discovered that the Americans were now even more lethal than before. Captain Michael Thompson from Pennsylvania experienced this shift firsthand in January of 1945 when his flight of 4 P-51s encountered a lone Mi-262 jet near Berlin. The German jet had nearly a 100-mile-per-hour speed advantage, and traditionally such speed made it nearly untouchable for propeller aircraft. However, the German pilot made a fatal error when he attempted to turn with the Mustangs rather than escape. Thompson locked his K-14 onto the jet as both aircraft maneuvered. The jet pilot, believing himself safe, accelerated into a climb, but the K-14 had already solved the geometry. Thompson fired a burst of 4 seconds into what appeared to be empty sky. The Mi-262 flew directly into the line of bullets. Its right engine exploded, and it fell into a spin, the pilot bailing out moments later. That German pilot, Lieutenant Wilhelm Bauer, was captured and spent his interrogation asking how the American had possibly predicted his movement. When he learned about the computing gun sight, he admitted that if he had known such a device existed, he would never have attempted to fight at all. He would have used the jet speed only to avoid combat, because to engage a K-14 equipped Mustang in a turning fight meant certain defeat. The air war had transformed so completely that the most advanced aircraft Germany built was rendered vulnerable by a device that weighed less than 20 pounds. The message was clear. The future belonged to those who embraced the power of computation. And the Luftwaffe had run out of time. The K-14 gunsight had reached a level of influence so great that even the most advanced aircraft in the German arsenal could no longer guarantee survival because the device stripped away the final advantage of instinctive flying and replaced it with precise mathematical prediction that no human pilot could match. By February of 1945, the Luftwaffe was no longer a functioning fighting force. They still had aircraft in hangars, but little fuel to fly them, and pilots with barely any training were being pushed into the sky with orders so desperate that some were told to ram American bombers because they lacked the skill and equipment to fight in traditional ways. The K-14 had transformed air combat from an art shaped by instinct into a science shaped by calculation, and the Germans had lost the scientific race. In early February, a Mustang pilot named Lieutenant William Davis from Iowa demonstrated just how devastating the new American advantage had become. During a single mission on the 9th of February, he shot down 5 German fighters. None of the German pilots opposing him had more than 20 hours of combat experience, and most had never faced an enemy pilot before. They climbed into their cockpits already doomed because the K-14 allowed Davis to place every burst with perfect timing hitting them before they even understood the shape of the battle forming around them. In April, the Luftwaffe attempted one final massive effort to challenge American dominance. On the 7th of April 1945, they gathered every flyable fighter remaining in northern Germany and launched 183 aircraft against American bombers. But the Americans met them with more than 800 fighters, most carrying the K-14. The result was a slaughter. 133 German aircraft were shot down, while the Americans lost only 23, mostly to ground fire or mechanical failure. In the air-to-air fighting, the kill rate reached levels unseen in the war. American pilots recorded hit percentages above 40%, a number that would have been considered impossible before the arrival of the computing gun sight. Many American flyers ran out of ammunition before the German formations were even broken because they were shooting down fighters faster than they could report them. One pilot, Captain James Miller from Washington, flew in that final major battle. He had been flying for 6 months, always with the K-14, and he wrote in his report that the engagement did not feel like a battle at all. The German pilots were brave but helpless. Many flew straight without weaving, making themselves easy targets. Others tried to maneuver, but their moves were predictable based on the simple patterns they had been taught during their brief training. The K-14 tracked each motion, easily calculating future positions faster than the German pilots could react. Miller shot down 4 fighters in 12 minutes using fewer than 600 rounds, a level of efficiency that earlier in the war would have been unimaginable. A month later, the war in Europe ended, but the effect of the computing gun sight continued shaping aviation. American pilots carried their experience into the Pacific, where they found that the K-14 gave them even greater superiority over Japanese fighters, whose pilots were not trained to face predictive aiming. The gun sight evolved into newer systems that eventually influenced the design of radar-guided missiles, heads-up displays, and fire control computers in modern jets. Every fighter pilot in the years that followed built their craft around the foundation created by this small analog computing device. One of the men who understood its importance most deeply was Lieutenant Colonel Robert Johnson, who ended the war with 27 victories. In his memoirs, he wrote that no other improvement in aircraft design had matched the impact of the K-14. Not the engines, not the armor, not the long-range fuel tanks. The computing gun sight changed everything because it solved the hardest part of aerial warfare. It took the mystery out of deflection shooting and turned average pilots into lethal hunters. German pilots confirmed this after the war during interrogation sessions. They did not speak mainly of the P-51's range or American production strength. They spoke about the moment when American pilots suddenly stopped missing. Major Johannes Stein, a respected Luftwaffe ace with 176 victories, said fighting K-14-equipped Mustangs was like fighting enemies from the future because they could strike from angles that should have been safe. For the Luftwaffe, the human cost was enormous. In the final year of the war, they lost more than 13,000 pilots killed or captured. Many were young men barely trained and facing an opponent whose weapons made even short engagements fatal. For these German pilots, there was no chance to learn, improve, or adapt. They died facing a device they did not understand and could not counter. The K-14 had not merely helped win the air war. It had changed its nature completely. By the final months of 1945, American pilots, many barely out of training, were shooting down German veterans who had survived Poland-France, the Battle of Britain and Russia. The shift was so great that skill no longer guaranteed survival. Technology had become the decisive force, and the K-14 guided every burst with an accuracy that erased years of German mastery. Those who had once defined air combat through instinct and brilliance now found themselves hunted by American farm boys carrying a device that turned them into mathematical predators. In this way, the K-14 marked the true turning point of the war, not in strategy or numbers, but in the simple fact that from the moment Americans could compute their shots with machine precision, the old world of aerial duels ended forever. The story of the younger Marseille became one of the clearest reflections of how completely the K-14 had rewritten the rules of aerial combat because he had grown up idolizing his older brother Hans-Joachim Marseille, who had been one of the greatest natural marksmen the Luftwaffe ever produced. Before dying in 1942, the younger Marseille tried desperately to follow in that legendary path, spending years practicing deflection, shooting, hoping to match the instinctive brilliance his brother had possessed. By 1945, he was flying in the defense of the Reich, and still carried the belief that skill alone could overcome any opponent. But in January of that year, during a battle over Hanover, he faced something that even his brother's legacy could not prepare him for. His opponent was Lieutenant Carl Peterson from Nebraska, a young American who had grown up on a farm and joined the Army Air Forces after Pearl Harbor with no special talent in shooting or flying. Peterson had almost washed out during training because he struggled with basic aiming techniques, yet the K-14 allowed him to place his shots with a precision that exceeded anything the younger Marseille had imagined possible. In a swirling dogfight, Peterson tracked him through turns, climbs and dives, then fired a deflection shot so perfect that even the older Marseille would have admired it. The younger Marseille survived by parachuting out, severely burned, and when he later learned that a machine, not raw instinct, had guided the American burst, he admitted that he was grateful his brother had died before witnessing what air combat had become. In his words, it no longer resembled a contest of skill, but rather a mathematical equation solved by machines. After the war, the influence of this technology spread across the world at astonishing speed. The Soviets demanded their own copies through Lend-Lease shipments and quickly began reverse engineering them. The British improved their versions by making them smaller, more reliable, and easier to maintain. The French rebuilt their shattered air force with the computing gunsight as a mandatory requirement for every new fighter they produced. Within 5 years of the war's end, every major air force in the world was using some form of this technology, and the age of instinctive aerial combat ended. One of the first American pilots to truly understand the long-term impact was Lieutenant David Williams, who had been one of the earliest users of the K-14 in Europe. He stayed in the Air Force and became an instructor, teaching new generations how to rely on increasingly sophisticated aiming systems. During the Korean War, he flew an F-86 Sabre, equipped with an improved descendant of the K-14, and shot down 3 MiG-15 fighters. The MiG pilots had been trained in the best Soviet schools and flew faster, more advanced aircraft, but Williams had something they did not. He had a machine that could solve deflection problems faster than either pilot could react. He retired in 1963 after witnessing air combat evolve from raw instinct to a battle of computers and guidance systems. In one interview, he remarked that the introduction of the K-14 had been the true end of the romantic era of fighter pilots, because after that point, victory belonged to those with the best technology, not necessarily the best skill. German pilots who survived the war offered differing perspectives. Some, like Adolf Galland, admitted openly that they had been outclassed by American engineering. Others insisted that skill still mattered and that the K-14 was merely a tool that did not replace true experience. But the numbers from the final year of the war told a harsher truth. As more American fighters received computing gunsights and more German pilots entered combat with minimal training, the kill ratio soared to 10-1 in favor of the Americans. Experience could not overcome the precision of a machine that erased human error. One German ace major, Richard Naumann, who scored 37 victories, went on to become an aerospace engineer after the war. In a paper he published in 1955, he calculated that the computing gunsight effectively gave an American pilot the equivalent of 2 full years of gunnery training. The device compressed the learning curve so completely that a pilot could become deadly accurate after only a few missions. He argued that this was the true revolution, not the engineering itself, but the way it turned novices into experts with astonishing speed. The last German pilot to encounter a K-14 Mustang in combat was likely Lieutenant Klaus Müller, who flew a worn-out Messerschmitt 109 on May 8, 1945, the very day Germany surrendered. Muller had taken off from a hidden strip in Czechoslovakia, unaware that the war was already over. Trying to attack advancing Soviet ground forces, he encountered a flight of American P-51s. Following his training, he attempted to engage. The lead American pilot, Captain Tom Anderson from Wisconsin, locked the K-14 onto him and had a perfect firing solution, but instead of firing, Anderson flew beside Muller and signaled for him to land. Muller, seeing the gesture and sensing that something had changed, followed the Mustang to an American field and surrendered. Only then did he learn the war had ended hours earlier. Curious, he asked to see the American gunsight, and Anderson showed him the K-14, explaining how it worked. Muller had been flying barely a month and had never shot down a single aircraft. After seeing the device, he quietly said it was probably a good thing the war had ended because he would not have survived another mission. The experience of pilots like Muller confirmed what many already believed. The age of human instinct ruling the skies had ended. Machines now shaped the outcome, and the pilots who fought against them understood too late that they were battling a future they could not stop. Lieutenant Klaus Muller's surrender on the final day of the war symbolized the truth that every surviving German pilot eventually accepted because the K-14 had not merely given the Americans sharper aim, it had erased an entire era of aerial combat where instinct and experience once ruled skies. For pilots like Muller, who had flown only a handful of missions, the device represented a future that had arrived too quickly for them to grasp. Yet the legacy of the computing gunsight extended far beyond the battlefields of Europe. Its technology became a foundation for early ballistic missile guidance systems, and its advanced gyroscopes influenced submarine navigation and even spacecraft development. The idea of computer-aided aiming that began with a small analog mechanism inside a P-51 cockpit evolved into modern fire control systems able to track and engage multiple enemies at once. Every fighter pilot today who looks through a heads-up display that shows a perfect firing solution is using a direct descendant of that first revolutionary gunsight. The revolution had begun in 1944 when German pilots mocked the poor aim of American fighters, but their laughter disappeared once the K-14 changed everything. One of the first American pilots to witness this transformation, Lieutenant James Howard, who had stunned the Luftwaffe over Berlin, reflected late in his life on how completely the device altered the nature of air combat. Before its arrival, a pilot's success depended on instinct, steady nerves, and long practice. Afterward, the machine took over the most difficult tasks, performing calculations that no human brain could manage in the heat of battle. Howard said the greatest change was not simply that the Americans could finally hit German fighters, but that technology had proven it could make ordinary people perform extraordinary feats. German pilots had been correct in one regard. Many American flyers could not shoot well at all during the early years of the war. But once the K-14 entered service, they no longer needed perfect instinct because the gunsight performed the calculations every time. The numbers recorded after its introduction told the story with brutal clarity. Before the arrival of the computing sight, an American fighter pilot typically fired 1,000 rounds for every enemy aircraft destroyed. Afterward, that number dropped to fewer than 250 rounds. Hit probability rose from 2% to more than 30%. Kill ratios reversed in a matter of months, shifting from 3-to-1 in favor of the Germans to 10-to-1 in favor of the Americans. No other single piece of equipment in the air war produced such a dramatic overnight shift in power. It transformed both veteran pilots and green rookies into marksmen capable of landing shots from distances and angles that would once have been considered impossible. The Luftwaffe learned this truth the hard way. The last living German ace, speaking in 2010, explained that the moment he first encountered the K-14, he knew the war was lost not because Germany lacked the intelligence to build a similar device, but because America possessed the industrial strength, scientific infrastructure, and wartime momentum to design, mass-produce, deploy, and train thousands of pilots to use such technology in the middle of a global conflict. That vast machine of industry and invention was something Germany could not match despite its own technological brilliance. As one Luftwaffe officer put it, the Americans were fighting with mathematics as much as bullets. By the spring of 1944, German pilots stopped laughing because they realized they were no longer fighting individuals, but entire systems of engineering that never tired, never hesitated, and never miscalculated. Through the remainder of the war, thousands of German pilots, most of them teenagers with minimal training, were sent into the air, where they faced opponents who carried a device capable of predicting their next move before it happened. Many died without ever firing a shot. Others fought bravely, but were overwhelmed by pilots who had flown only a few missions yet could shoot, as if they had spent years perfecting the craft. The K-14 did not simply tilt the odds. It reshaped the battlefield into a place where human instinct was no match for mechanical precision. The final example of this came in the last weeks of April 1945, when Lieutenant Heinrich Bartels, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced pilots, with 99 victories, fought for his life in the skies above Germany. Bartels had survived the Polish campaign, the Battle of Britain, and the brutal Eastern Front. He had mastered every evasive technique known to the Luftwaffe, including barrel rolls, snap turns, and high-speed dives. Yet when he encountered a young Mustang pilot named Lieutenant Wayne Coleman from Arkansas, on only his 7th combat mission, none of Bartels' skill could save him. Coleman placed the Pipper ahead of Bartels' flight path, trusted the device, and fired a burst. Bartels fell from the sky, a victim not of inexperience or recklessness, but of a machine that erased the advantage he had spent years mastering. Coleman later said he felt sorrow for killing such an experienced opponent, but admitted the shot had been almost too easy because the gunsight solved the problem for him. What Bartels never understood, and what many German pilots did not realize until long after the war, was that they had never been fighting the Americans alone. They had been fighting American mathematics, American engineering, and American industrial power, all embodied in a small device mounted inside a P-51 Mustang. The K-14 was more than a gunsight. It was a symbol of a world changing from human instinct to technological dominance. It ensured that farm boys from Kansas and mechanics from Georgia could fly with the accuracy of aces and turn the tide of war in a matter of months. The laughter that had echoed across German cockpits early in 1944 vanished as the truth became undeniable. They were not fighting the skills of individual pilots, they were fighting the future. And the future had already won. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.